Hi friends, I am Rob. Here we are on the heels of Thanksgiving for those of us in the United States, and we can start looking forward without too much guilt towards the holiday season. So I can break out a little bit of holiday finery and hopefully not get lambasted too badly. This is going to mark the start of a new series. One of the things that I've always been fascinated with in role-playing game manuals is when examples of gameplay are included, it's probably our clearest snapshot into the minds of the game developers as to how they imagine their games are going to be played. Now, if you've played role-playing games, you can know that the timbre of the players, their experience level, and oftentimes just the kind of game they're playing can wildly differ from these examples. But, like I said, we're just kind of looking at the world that the creator of the game is building for their fictional players, unless these are excerpts taken from actual gameplay in their group, although from reading some of these I tend to doubt it. And I thought I would read from these, and we can all kind of get an appreciation for what the authors of these particular game manuals were trying to do, or could imagine the way that their game was going to be played. So, for today, we're going to go back a ways to the Dungeon Master's Guide, 1st edition, to look at, well, this is credited to Gary Gygax. We know that he wrote with a lot of people, but this might entirely be his creation. So I'm going to read from this, and for those of you who aren't experienced with 1st edition D&D and the way that it was played, this might give you some insights as to how that older school style of play was done. Now, the principal characters in this are the Dungeon Master. We have the leader of the party. Now, that's not just titular for the actual character who does most of the talking and directs people. In Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, you had one person who was designated as the leader, and they got with the rest of the players and made decisions and were the person that could basically direct what the group was doing without the Game Master having to hear from lots of different voices. While today that may seem terribly archaic, it actually worked fairly well for large groups. It took the management and spread it across to another person rather than the Dungeon Master having to constantly canvass everybody as to what they were doing. And if a particular player felt that they weren't being represented well enough, well, that was the skill of the leader to be able to take everybody's words together. Also, frequently, the Game Master will reference another player when they have questions. But in this, when you usually read these, you get a lot of, they assign names to the individual players and maybe even to the Game Master. In this is in the Dungeon Master's Guide. It's not floral text to help imprint a pattern for the players. This is so that a Game Master can appreciate kind of the ebb and flow of how dungeon exploration works, which was the principal method of play for Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. So, I will begin. From the Dungeon Master. What are you going to do now? The leader. Light our torches and go down the steps. Dungeon Master. Fine, but I'll need the marching order you will be in. At this point, the players either write down the names of characters, with each in its respective rank, or place their painted miniature figures in actual formation. As minimum width is about 3.5 or 3 1/3 feet per character. They didn't round up to 5 like we do in many modern games. A 5-foot wide corridor requires single file. A 10-foot wide passage means up to 3 may be abreast, and up to 6 abreast can move down a 20-foot wide passageway. This is kind of a measure of the wargame aspect, where they would try to pack as many people in a space as possible. and taking into account average size of a person, how much space they may need to wield a weapon. That kind of overruled to a certain extent in this early iteration of the game the expedience of just saying everybody takes up a 5-foot section. Please note what formation you will take in a 5-foot wide passageway and what your marching order will be in a 20-foot wide area also. So he wanted multiple marching orders showing how the party could spread out and then contract when they're in a constricted area. The leader, after a brief discussion with the other players, here is the information on the sheet of notepaper. We'll change it only if one of us is wounded, lost, or killed. All of which were valid possibilities in Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. Why are the gnome and the halfling in the front rank, the magic user in the middle, and the human fighter and cleric in the rear? This is just the Dungeon Master asking about the tactics if they've considered everything. Again, the leader. This way, all 5 of us can act when we encounter an enemy. The magic user can cast spells over the heads of the short characters in front, and the pair in the back rank can do likewise, or fire missiles, or whatever is needed, including a quick move up to the front. The DM nods in agreement. You remember that the torches will spoil the infravisual capabilities of the gnome and the halfling, don't you? Certainly, but the humans must be able to see. We will go down the stairs now with weapons drawn and ready. I always generally assume that players, when they're in a dangerous situation, will have their weapons drawn and ready, and probably their shields too, but back in the day, you kind of had to keep on your toes with things like that. So the Dungeon Master, you descend southward possibly 30 feet laterally, and at the end of the stairway you see an open space. We enter the area and look around. You are in a chamber about 30 feet across to the south and 30 feet wide east and west. There are 10-foot wide passages to left and right and ahead, each in the center of the respective walls. The stairway you descended likewise enters the chamber at the center of the north wall. Now, while the Dungeon Master is describing this, one of the players was usually designated as a mapper. And as the Dungeon Master is describing this, they should be, frenziedly drawing in the area around so that the party can take a look at where they're at. Otherwise, this is how information was conveyed. There weren't pre-made maps usually. One of the members of the group had to do all of that, and sometimes a couple, just in case of confusion or ambiguity. Sometimes their actual characters would walk around with different devices for mapping themselves, a length of cord so they can measure distance accurately, a plumb bob so you can determine slope in your area. Players were quite creative sometimes in how they actually went about finding out a true map for the area they were in as close as possible. So, interesting difference from a lot of games these days, where quite often, a lot of times, you just have a pre-made map and the players will go to that space. This was a lot also of the challenge of the game. Because you had a role that was determined to do this, the better that person's skill was in mapping and cartography, from what the Dungeon Master said, the better off the whole group was in terms of not getting lost in sometimes fiendish dungeons. What else do we see, again from the leader? The floor is damp and rough. There are arches supporting the ceiling, starting from a spot about 8 feet above the floor and meeting about 20 feet high in the central dome of the place. It is difficult to tell because the whole ceiling area is covered with webs, possibly old cobwebs. Oh yes, there are some moldering sacks in the southwest corner and some rubbish jumbled in the center of the floor, which appears to be dirt, old leather, rotting cloth, and possibly sticks or bones or something similar. A confused babble breaks out at this point, with players suggesting all sorts of different actions. The leader cautions them and tries for a careful, reasoned, methodical approach. The gnome and the halfling will hand their torches to the fighter, that's me, and the cleric They will then look down the east and west passages while I check the one straight ahead to the south. The cleric will check the sacks, and the magic user will examine the pile of refuse in the center of the chamber. Does everyone agree? So note that you have a lot of trust in the leader in this place, because they have a very limited amount of time usually to gather all the suggestions, try to figure out a way to take everybody's suggestions in context, and then lay it out for the game master, the dungeon master in this case. How much would you trust another one of the players at your table with being able to speak in your best interests? Because once everybody agrees to what the leader says, the dungeon master takes that into account and immediately sets forth with reacting to whatever happens. Quite a bit different from the way many people play, I think you'll agree. Also, there is a general need, generally for the leader of the group, to consider the strengths and talents of everybody at a glance. Now that's a little bit trickier than just running a character, because rather than only having to worry about your own abilities, you also have to take into account the strengths and weaknesses of others. For instance, a different leader might not want to have the magic user go off and do anything. They might want the magic user to stay by the fighter at all times for their own protection, so the fighter can step in front of any danger. In this case, they're kind of splitting up around the room, even though it's not very large. They're splitting up so that they can all take care of their various strengths. The halfling and the gnome can use their infravision to look down the chambers to see if there's anything without having their light spoiled by the torches. The fighter, even though his range for his torchlight isn't that great, is still going to look to try to avoid or head off any kind of surprises, while the others are getting the information as quickly as possible, because you don't want to linger in one spot in an active dungeon. Wandering monsters could always come through, and wandering monster encounters back in the day, well, they were suboptimal. You were generally fighting a monster without its lair treasure, and it was just another encounter that could wear down your resources and possibly kill you. So a lot of times speedy dungeon delves were optimal on how players would go through. So I think you can see the need of the skill of the players involved, not just having high attributes, because that didn't have as much to do with how successful you were in these older games. So, as you will continue to see. So the other characters, sure, says the player with the cleric character, I'm moving over to the sacks now, sticking close to the left-hand wall. Again, how you do something back in this edition was often important, with traps possibly being strewn around the center of the room, or any other reason that the cleric's character might suspect something might happen. They're sticking close to the wall and clearly outlining what they're doing, rather than letting the dungeon master interpret a direct line that could lead them in trouble. From the dungeon master. What are the rest of you doing? As indicated? Tell me how you are doing it, please. If miniature figures in a floor plan are being used, each player can simply move his or her figurine to show route of movement or final position. Otherwise, each player must describe actions just as the cleric character player did above. One thing I just want to point out, the writer does make pains to say his or her. A lot of the assumptions that these games were strictly for males is, well, that's not quite true. And a lot of the language in these books does indicate that there, was intended female membership in these games as well, which is fine. Notice that these roles are all gender neutral too, so it could be a male, could be a female in any of them. So, again, the Dungeon Master wants clarification on the orders, and he's giving an opportunity for each of the players to make their decisions on how they're going to do things, because the way that they act will have an impact on the encounter ahead. Okay, the leader once more. They are now in position. What is seen and what happens? Just as the three are about in position to look down the passages, and while the cleric is heading for the rotting bags. Now, generally, if there was something in the corridors that they would react to quickly, rather than doing a detailed examination and perception, the Dungeon Master would preempt things to say, oh, you see something humanoid shaped in the corridor, or something like that. You have to take into account that the players will react as living beings, or at least their characters will, and they will prioritize the first thing they see. If it's a threat, they would focus on it. But as you can see, the encounter is just about to start. The magic user cries out, and you see something black and nasty looking upon her shoulder. So, things have started. The leader, everybody, quick, see what's attacked her. Then turning to the referee, we rush over to help kill whatever has attacked her. What do we see? Again, the Dungeon Master. A large spider has surprised her. As she went to examine the refuse it dropped from its web, it landed on her back and bit her. Before you can take any action, she must make a saving throw with a +2 on her die, of course. And then she and the spider must dice for initiative and fight a round of combat. After that, the rest can try to do something. Okay, so the DM is authoritatively saying, this is what happens, this is what you have to do, let's resolve this and move on. That's a good skill for a Dungeon Master to have, especially in these kind of games. You don't always want deliberation from everybody. Sometimes you just want to get into the action, resolve it, and go. In this case, the magic user is at a disadvantage fighting against a spider that is right on her. From the magic user, a 16, did I make it? This is said as she rolls the die to make a required saving throw against the spider's poison. Yes, easily. So you only take 1 hit point of damage. While you mark it down, I'll roll for the spider's initiative. Beat a 3. Again, from the magic user, a 5. That means I can act before the spider does. I'll grab it and throw it to the floor and stamp on it with my boot. This kind of enthusiastic response to an encounter, especially one that's suboptimal, is something, again, to be encouraged. You want your player to think in the moment, oh my gosh, something just dropped on my shoulder, I want to get rid of it and deal with it. And I think that's something that the writer is clearly intent on delivering that experience and wanting to represent that, which is good. I would like to see that kind of enthusiasm when I run games myself. So, from the DM, roll a d20 and we'll see if you hit. The die score indicates that the magic user would hit an opponent of the armor class of the large spider. So the DM states, you grab the spider, but as you do so, you are now allowing the monster to attack you, even though you had the initiative, and it bites your hand as you hurl it to the floor. Amidst groans of horrified anticipation from the players, the DM rolls a 20-sided die, but the low number which results indicates a clean miss by the arachnid. Yug, the nasty thing misses you, and it is now scuttling along the floor where you tossed it. Note, quick determination, quick adjudication of what was going to happen. He allowed a roll, he let the roll stand, she did what she wanted to do without having to roll a strength score or anything like that. It's just boom, grab it, throw it, boom, resolved, done. He gave the spider basically an attack of opportunity for her grabbing it and throwing it off. Had she decided to use something else, or perhaps he wouldn't have done that. But you had the drama of the moment, the reaction, it got a chance to bite, didn't hit, the flow of the story continues and it's tense. We just saw what happened, now it's ready for the party to go and squish the spider. And it is scuttling along the floor, which means it wants to get out of there. The leader goes, who is nearest to the spider? Whomever it is will smash it with a weapon. Depending on which weapon. It was hurled down to the southwest, and it is now heading for the wall, there to climb back into its web overhead. The cleric is nearest to it. Whether or not the Dungeon Master rolled a die, or just determined where the magic user was facing and where it would have been thrown to, it's up to the style of the individual Dungeon Master. Either would have been accurate. But again, quite often, a lot of times, and especially these older games, you don't need to roll randomly for everything. Sometimes just a quick determination to keep the action going is useful and important. From the cleric, of course, I squashed the nasty thing with my mace. And here the player, having already gained savoir-faire, rolls a d20 to see if his strike is successful. A 20, and a beaming player shouts, "I got it!" You're right, and you do. With these words, the DM rolls a d6. Can any of you imagine letting the Dungeon Master roll your damage dice? That's how it was done back in the day. All the players did was roll to see if they succeeded, and then the Dungeon Master interpreted everything else. Why? This is important. Why would the Dungeon Master roll for hit points? Because when you roll damage, and the damage is related to the players, if they hit and they took away a third of the monster's hit points with the swing, the DM can describe it as being really a great hit that rocks the monster and wounds it deeply. Now, if it took away a third of those hit points because you rolled 2 points of damage, as opposed to hitting full on and doing 6 points of damage, the players would instantly know how many hit points the monster has based on familiarity with the narration of the DM. So in this case, you take away the ability for the player to know exactly how much damage they did, and the Dungeon Master's narration is all the players have to go on. It creates a sense of mystery and wonder about the encounter, so the players aren't mentally cataloging exactly how many hit points they have. And believe me, I know we all do it. So, an interesting way of doing it. More work for the Dungeon Master, however, and a lot of reason why that gets streamlined out later. So, 6 points. That's heavy. Heavy enough to kill it, in fact. It was smashed to pieces. What now? In this case, the Dungeon Master is telling them how many points. There's really no downside to it because you're killing it in one swing. But it's enough to let the players be excited about the success of their roll. The cleric gets a cool martial success by smashing the spider. Lets him feel really cool. It's a good way of approaching it. The leader. Everybody will do what we set out to do in the first place. If nothing valuable or interesting is in the sacks, the cleric will then help the magic user search the refuse and burn the webs overhead in case there are any more spiders hiding up there. Interesting that wasn't the first response. Usually when a spider drops out of webbing, players want that webbing to die, but so be it. The sacks hold rotten grain, so the cleric will go and help the magic user as ordered. They find the refuse consists of castings, some husks of small victims of the spider, hide, bones, a small humanoid skull, and 19 silver pieces. Do you now fire the webs overhead? Examine the skull first. What kind of humanoid was it? Can we tell? Now again, this is the leader and the game master having a conversation. The other players can be whispering in the leader's ear, passing notes, what have you. But generally, if the players aren't adding anything to the discussion or don't hear anything too outrageous from the leader, generally it was good manners to let the leader do their job until you had to interject something because you wanted your character specifically to do something, or you disagreed strongly with what the leader was going to have your character do. Different time, certainly a different time. So, the skull is possibly a goblin. When you are looking at it more closely, you see that there's a small gem inside, a garnet. That's more like it. Put it safely in your pouch, along with the silver pieces, good cleric, and light the spider web. The strands burn quickly, flame running along each and lighting others touched. You see several young spiders crisped in the mass of webs near the top of the chamber, crisped as the mass of webs near the top of the chamber catches fire. Well, that's that. What is seen down the 3 corridors leading out of the place? The east passage appears to turn north after about 30 feet or so. The range of infravision, I believe, was about 60 feet, so they'd be able to tell that. The south tunnel runs straight as far as can be seen. Again, this is the fighter wielding a torch, so it might not be all that far. I think they had a range out to 30 feet with torchlight. And the west corridor ends in a door at about 20 feet. The leader again. Come on, fellow adventurers, let's head west and see what lurks beyond the door. The other players concur, so marching order is reestablished, and the gnome and halfling lead the way. Different groups have different priorities or different ways of dealing with doors. A lot of people think that if there's a door, it kind of naturally blocks out the sound of their adventuring. So a door is better left to the back, and open passages are better left explored and neutralized first, but different groups have different methods. Plus, this also gets us to how to handle a door quicker, so that's useful. Okay, you're marching west 10 feet, 20 feet, and the passage ends in a door to the west. That's for the benefit of the mapper. So, the mapper is currently trying to make an accurate map of this. It is a great heavy thing bound in corroded bronze. There is a huge ring in the center. Doors mattered a bit more back in the day. There weren't standard doors. A lot of doors were, more descriptive to them. So the players had a sense on each door if there were any kind of hints as to what could be behind it, what created it, what state the door is in. Might it be stuck if it's wet and swollen? If there's a lock on it that clearly needs to be looked at, if there's any kind of design or symbol, or sometimes foreboding about whether or not it might be trapped. Generally, it's a good idea to assume that all doors are trapped, but still. Again, the leader. Magic user, step forward and listen at the door. Gnome and halfling, see which way it opens and get ready to do so. Magic user walks forward to listen at the door. Okay. Some people would think that's a little silly, putting the magic user right up at the front by the door, but okay. And honestly, too, it allows the action people to be ready to immediately support the wizard, so it's not so silly. So the DM rolls a d6 behind the screen, and so that the players cannot see the result, which would normally indicate if noise were detected or not. If applicable, when a character listens. In this case, the DM knows what will be heard, but pretends otherwise. So in this case, again, this is emphasizing the need for the DM to roll things the players will not know about. And therefore, if, for example, if you are a player and you roll a perception check, and you roll natural 20, you expect to know whatever you're going to hear. If that roll is taken away from you, you could have made it, you could have missed it. You don't know. So it again creates a sense of uncertainty where oftentimes you just have to make your best guess. A lot of good gameplay is done on gut feeling as much as anything. There is a faint moaning sound. You can't really tell what it is, which rises and then fades away. The door pulls toward you. The hinges are on the left. Okay, we all get ready. I'll knock an arrow, and the magic user will ready her magic missile spell. As soon as we are set, the cleric and the gnome will pull the door open. The cleric closest to the hinge side. Ready? Go! Now, these kind of tactics for doing something as relatively simple as opening a door have been practiced and perfected by players up to this point. There's a tactical elegance to just the simple action of opening a door that when you're not sure what's on the other side. In this case, all weapons pointed at the main area of threat, the door itself. They don't have enough players to keep an eye on their back and sides as much, so they're just going to focus on the front and deal with whatever challenges in front of them, which is how you do it. Also, positioning is important. Again, most of those descriptions could be done by placing miniatures and moving them around in the area, but those things are important as to the person who is in the greatest area of threat is the person who is going to have the most exposure, the one by the side where the door is opening. So that is not the cleric, who is a more important figure not to get hurt. He's on the somewhat more sheltered side closest to the hinges. So that's tactics for you. And everybody is ready to bring a weapon to bear who are not going to have their hands operating the door.